There are two main views on the authorship of the four Gospels found in the New Testament. The traditional view, which states that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, Matthew wrote Matthew, etc., and the modern mainstream scholastic view, being that we have no idea who wrote these four works. This will be a case for traditional authorship utilizing almost all good evidence available for the positive position. When attempting to figure out who wrote a piece of literature from the ancient past without appealing to the work itself, the only place we can turn are to other writers of the time period. Knowing who the general tradition points to can be very insightful, especially if it is unanimous and multiply attested and early. So here's a list of every source that talks about their authorship. From these authors, we know the tradition was widespread and unanimous with no surviving competing traditions. It seems most likely, therefore, that these traditions originated very early on after the Gospels were written because they were spread far and fast. It seems extremely unlikely all of these traditions were just made up from nothing, so it seems most probable that at least most of these traditions have some basis in truth. There is no other instance in history where there has been early, unanimous attestation of authorship about several given works, where modern historians doubt all the book's authorship, and it seems unreasonable or post hoc to apply a different standard to the Gospels. Augustine summarizes this well in Contra Faustus 33:6, where he answers the first questioning of the Gospel's authorship by Faustus in the 4th century. Now that we've looked outside of the works, we should address the claim that the works themselves don't identify who wrote them. It's commonly asserted that the names in the titles of each gospel were not on the originals, but added much later. However, this seems very unlikely. Every single manuscript that includes the title of these gospels includes its corresponding author. There are none without the traditional names. Thus, these names were probably on the gospels since the originals, because if, say, for the first couple decades, as an example, it was truly anonymous, how would all people and copyists suddenly all agree to start writing a given name on all their new manuscripts? And this gets harder as time goes on. The church had no such authority to impose it, as if it were some kind of empire sending out decrees. If the names were added far later, we would likely at least have one surviving branch of manuscript copies that have anonymous copies. For this process to happen with all four Gospels just makes it infinitely more improbable. As copies continue to be made out of the subsequent copies, only a small portion of copies would actually have the added title. Thus, in order for all the manuscripts to be unanimous among all text groups, almost all copies would have to have had been made from ones with the title, or the title was added in the copy after the original, and that said original never had a separate copy chain made from it. However, there is no reason to assume such unlikely events happened, especially 4 out of 4 times. It seems way simpler to conclude that the Gospels had their names in the titles originally. In addition to this, it's not as if after a manuscript was copied from it was destroyed. Copies could still be reviewed after that they had copies made from them, and could continue to have copies made from them, and some copies could potentially stick around for decades. In addition to attestation within and outside of the Gospels, there are also a lot of facts which are inconsistent with a reality where the authorship was originally anonymous. For example, if the church were to make up names for the Gospels, why attribute the synoptic Gospels to obscure people who aren't even apostles? Luke is only referenced in 3 of Paul's letters, and Mark is sparsely mentioned in Acts, and name-dropped in 4 other New Testament documents. If you are making up a false gospel author, why on earth would you choose them over an apostle, or for that matter, a famous apostle? Why not Peter or John, etc.? Even if they were going to choose someone else besides the 12, they could have chosen someone like Jesus' brother James, or even Paul. It would seem the simplest explanation as to why they selected these obscure figures, who nobody even claims were witnesses, is because the church didn't invent the names. The same argument can be made for Matthew, though less strongly. Matthew is practically only known for his gospel. Other than that, the only thing that makes him worth selecting as an author is that he was an apostle. But almost any other apostle would be more famous than him. Take Philip, Thomas, Peter, Andrew, or John. Matthew is almost as irrelevant as you can be as an apostle without this gospel attribution, so there doesn't seem to be much of any reason to select him as the author. In addition to this, why make the face of a gospel oriented towards Jews a tax collector? A couple of additional arguments specifically for Matthew. First, given how many times Matthew references the Old Testament, it seems most likely he was pretty familiar with it. This makes the most sense if he was a literate Jew, which Matthew would be. Second, Matthew's gospel mentions money way more than the others. He is the only one to mention the parable of the talents, and he is the only one to mention gold. This is consistent with the idea the author is a tax collector, someone who in ancient Israel during 30 AD generally extorted their own people to amass wealth, thus being seen as a traitor. With this in mind, it would make perfect sense for a tax collector to remember the details of Jesus' teaching on money, especially aspects that would run counter and or directly stick out to the average tax collector, like seen in Matthew 6:24, 10:9, and 25:14 through 30. Moving on to Mark's arguments. First, it must be noted that the tradition about how Mark's gospel was written is that Peter recalled events and Mark wrote them down as basically his scribe. So the first argument for this being Mark appears to portray many stories through the perspective of Peter, a very good example being chapter 14, 33 through 42. Secondly, there are extremely sparse details given until Peter is called. All the events Mark historically recorded before Peter is present are the following: John preached and baptized, Jesus was baptized, Jesus was tempted in the desert, John was put in prison, and Jesus preached to repent and believe in the gospel. These events are mostly described in very little detail and are extremely significant. If Mark decided to compile his notes about what Peter said about Christ into a coherent gospel account, and had to fill in the blanks before Peter was called, it makes sense why they would be very significant and undetailed compared to after Peter comes into the picture. Coming to Luke, firstly, one of the reasons some scholars conclude Luke wrote Luke and Acts is because he uses medically accurate Greek terminology in his Gospel and Acts, which is consistent with him being a physician. Secondly, it seems unlikely someone would address a book to someone else anonymously, so it seems much more probable than not that the author of Luke at least named himself in the original. Thus, someone would need to change the name within the time frame of the first copies, but there is no reason to conclude this happened, so it seems more likely that it did not. Therefore, in all probability, it seems most likely the Gospel of Luke originally had a name addressed with it, and that name was not deliberately altered with the spread of copies. And then we come to John. Firstly, the author claims to be a witness. Secondly, in John 21:22 through 24, the gospel dispels a rumor which is apparently floating around that the beloved disciple would not die until Christ came back. From several church traditions, we know John probably lived into old age. Since this seems probably true, it makes perfect sense for a rumor like this to have circulated from an oral tradition about what Jesus said about the beloved disciple who lived into old age, and it makes sense for that disciple to try and dispel it. Given when John's gospel was most likely written, and given which disciples would be alive then, and that the rumor is supposedly about one of the 12, and that given the author claims to be this person, it must mean that the author claims to be John. John is the only one who would be alive to claim to be this person. Third, the author describes many details that a second or third-hand author seemingly would be unlikely to include or think of. For some examples, he mentions the exact number of fish caught, and he mentions the exact number of water jars at the wedding. Objections to the traditional authorship must be answered on an individual basis, of course, but it seems we have a good positive case for the traditional authorship, which, in the absence of counter data, is more than sufficient to justify rational belief in the traditional authorship for the four Gospels.